Amazing. Oh, hi. All right. Hi, everyone. Hi. Hello. So, my name is Andrea. And if you have seen me give a talk before, you can probably guess what we're talking about tonight.
Democracy!
Democracy? Ships?
Hold on. Suspense. Democracy! Ooh, ah. Excellent job, everybody. All right. And I know we don't have 3 hours to get into all the reasons why I love democracy. Right, guys? We don't have 3 hours? Okay. We don't have 3 hours. So I'm going to stick it to the one reason that I absolutely love democracy is I find the fight for our independence to be completely fascinating. Okay, there we go. Okay. Amazing. Amazing, everybody. All right. So if we're here to talk about, yeah, ship, boat, same family. So if we're here to talk about defiance, remember that an amateur, ununiformed, starving army defeated the global superpower and said, peace out to the rule of a king. So 249 years ago, we signed one of my favorite documents, the United States Constitution. But what I love most about the Constitution is not its original form, but how it has evolved over time. That's the plan. And we might remember from our history class that the very first words of our Constitution is "we the people." And I know that I am preaching a history that most of us are quite familiar with, but this "we the people" was constrained to a very specific type of person. But it was never intended to stay stagnant, at least by some accounts. Thomas Jefferson said that laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the human mind, or it is like trying to fit a grown-ass man into the coat he wore as a kid. I'm paraphrasing just a little bit. Just a little. Just a tad. So one line of the Constitution that I am particularly fascinated with, and it's actually still in its original form, is Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1. The election clause. Ooh. Thank you. Amazing quote. And what fascinates me about this little bite-sized sentence, it has created so much drama throughout American history. And so it essentially grants states the right to kind of do whatever the hell they want in terms of elections. Except this cute little thereof at the end. And now remember it, because I'm going to be quizzing you later. But in some ways, the election clause is a beautiful thing. The diversity and innovation of elections in our country is extraordinary. We have expanded access to the ballot in profound ways. But maybe I don't need to state the obvious. This also means that states can be creative in how they disenfranchise and suppress voters. Boo. So this meant that back in the day, without any amendments, the states all got to individually decide who could and who could not participate in elections. And for a while, all of them unilaterally decided it would be these white property-owning men, end of list. Some states even narrowed the criteria to vote further by having religious tests. And I'm going to point something out very quickly. New York was not one of these, exactly, New York was not one of these states, but New Jersey was. I'm just saying. I'm just putting it out there. But as time went on, states slowly started removing these barriers, and not necessarily because they were feeling generous, but it came from immense sacrifice and pressures from organized movements. And some of these efforts paid off because on February 3rd, 1870, we passed the 15th Amendment. And that expanded the electorate and granted all men the right to vote in every state, and this included black men. But as Gina Linetti says, because of systemic racism, even though black men had the constitutional right to participate in elections, states relied on the election clause to employ egregious barriers to prevent them from doing so. And this still happens today, right? I think we're all familiar with gerrymandering and registration purges. Boo. But this amendment still left out 50% of the population from our We the People. And then enter stage right, the Votes for Women movement. Stick it to the man. So not too long ago, a friend of mine convinced me to rewatch Mary Poppins. I have not seen it since I was a kid. I recommend you all do the same. It's a great movie. And this scene brought me to tears. Mrs. Banks breaks out into song about being soldiers in petticoats and casting off the shackles from yesterday for political equality and equal rights to men. But the part that struck me the most was the little subtle comment she makes. Quick, put the sashes away because you know how the cause infuriates Mr. Banks. Remember, stick it to Mr. Banks. But remember, even simply the belief that women should have the right to vote in this country was an act of defiance. And women were punished for having this belief. I did take all these pictures. Thank you so much, Jackie, with my fancy iPhone. Okay, but we all remember Susan B. Anthony. She was a leader in the Votes for Women movement. And she thought it was bullshit that she had to pay taxes in a country that she couldn't vote in.
Damn straight.
Damn straight, I agree with her. And you, Jackie. And so in 1872, she symbolically cast the ballot about 50 years before it would be legal for her to do so. And this act of defiance led her to getting arrested, indicted, tried, and thrown into jail by a jury of her fellow citizens. Amazing. Exactly. And if you haven't seen this statue, I really recommend taking a trip to Central Park to learn more about our girls, Susan, Katie, and Sojourner Truth. And she, Sojourner Truth, was a former slave who advocated against the discrimination black women experienced in the suffrage movement. And I point this out because it's always important to remember the contradictions that history is riddled with. Okay, so.
The country is a ship.
Yeah, it is a ship. So the suffrage movement held protests and relentless lobbying for states to grant women the right to vote. And very slowly, some of them were like, ugh, okay, fine. You can have it just a little bit. And we were still very far from national enfranchisement. And because of the election clause, each state could decide whether or not to include black women in these new laws. Stick it to the man. So this slow burn went on for years and years and years, for more than 40 years. Then, on March 3rd, 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, and almost exactly 112 years ago, thousands of women marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in the women's suffrage procession. And wait for your applause, because we had to point out the contradictions again, that black women were forced to march in the back of the parade. Well, let's get ready to stick it to the man and some women. That it was activist Ida Wells Barnett who defied these orders and joined the Illinois delegation, refusing to play the part of a second-class citizen. But so the point of this women's procession was to advocate for an amendment to the Constitution granting women across the entire nation access to the ballot. And this was really significant because what was that little word I told you to remember? Thereof. Amazing, yes, thereof, A+ for everybody. And so this little cutie of a word has sparked so much debate over time, but it essentially means that in some cases, the federal government can dictate the rules of elections that every single state must abide by, like a constitutional amendment expanding the electorate, as we did with the 15th Amendment.
Yeah.
Expanding the electorate. But all right, let's be serious. Okay, just kidding. But the reaction to this demand, stick it to the man and this demand, was cacophonous. During the procession, men on the sidelines jeered, they yelled, they made sexual propositions to the women, they manhandled them, and they literally spat on them. Unsanitary. And then in walks Inez Milholland. Or maybe I should say she rode in. Yeah. Because this badass was leading the procession, riding a white horse with a cape and a tiara with the Star of Hope on top. And the white dress she was wearing would inspire the women's movement to use white as the uniform to symbolize unity. And Inez, she was a born and raised Brooklynite. She was well known, I'm a Manhattanite, but like, give it up for Brooklyn. So she was a well-known advocate and lawyer for women's rights, and she would soon ascend to be the face of the women's suffrage movement. The New York Sun stated that no suffrage parade was complete without Inez Milholland. And so she traveled the country electrifying audiences about how women's votes could remove social ills like sweatshops, tenements, and child mortality.
Hell yeah.
But we needed to put in the work to get there. The New York Times quoted her in 1910 saying, "Until women in America are willing to take real sacrifice, we will not make the progress we need." And so she continued to tour across the country even when her health took a turn. The people close to her, including her own doctor, advised she quit the tour and rest. But she defied their advice and pressed on.
Stick it to that man.
Stick it to that. But on October 22nd, 1916, in the middle of a speech, she collapsed. The audience remembers what she said right before she fell. She said, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" And then a few weeks later, she paid the ultimate sacrifice, and she died at the age of 30. I know. But the story does get better, I promise. Her memorial was the first ever held in the United States Capitol for a woman. Yeah. Well, we love Inez. But the suffragists continued her fight in the fight for women enfranchisement. And it just took more churning and scraping and sacrifices from defiant women, like burning a literal effigy of Woodrow Wilson in front of the White House. Stick it to the man. Exactly. And these women would never run out of creative and theatrical ways to have their voices heard. They would do a hunger strike wearing prison uniforms. They hiked 200 miles in pilgrim boots, and they launched a suffrage barge down the Mississippi River. I couldn't find a picture of it. I wish I could, so pretend. And then finally, it came down to the last state that needed to vote in order to meet the 36-state threshold we needed to pass an amendment. And in the Tennessee state capitol, it turned into the War of the Roses. Legislators displayed how that they were going to vote on an amendment by wearing a flower. A yellow rose would signal support for the amendment, and a red rose would signal opposition. And it came down to one deciding vote. Harry Byrne entered the state capitol that day wearing a red rose. But while he was on the floor, his mother wrote him a note that said, "Be a good boy." And that note likely changed the course of history because he switched his vote to yes. And on August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment was officially certified. Yeah, that's the applause. All women across the United States were now included in We the People, and we had the right to vote. Huzzah! Thank you. I know how to get you guys. So a few years after the 19th Amendment finally was ratified, there was a celebration in D.C. honoring the suffrage movement. And a poet dedicated a sonnet to the spirit of Inez's work for justice and equality. And one line stands out to me. Make immortal my adventurous will. And this quote, to me, is why we revisit these stories in times of uncertainty. Remember that Susan B. Anthony and Inez Milholland would never cast a vote legally. They would never know how their defiance paid off, but their impact was immortal. The suffragists didn't know what was ahead, but they sacrificed their livelihood in hopes of what it could be. And something I have been thinking about a lot is when you learn about history, it's really easy to clump a whole bunch of years together, and we forget that each year lived within an era with the nauseating redundancy of unprecedented and history in the making is all without knowledge of how this chapter will end. What section is this going to be on kids' history exam in 100 years? We don't know, but how it is written is in our hands. And as I go on my little rah-rah monologue tangent, we need to accept that we may never see the fruits of our labor, but that did not stop the suffragists from laying the bricks and planting the seeds for a future that they hoped for. And so now, remember what Martin Luther King says. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So even if that arc feels far off, we all have to ask ourselves, what does defiance look like for me? What are the sacrifices we need to make? What are the effigies we need to burn? And how the hell do we finally get a bigger coat? Shout out to T. Jeff. And finally, perhaps most importantly, we must remember something that one of my favorite women says.
Tossing me the car keys, fuck the patriarchy.
All right, everybody. So let's raise a glass to the bravery, persistence, and defiance of we the people of the United States. Cheers.